Hi, everyone. Brad Free with David Aragona. This is Daily Racing Form's Derby Watch Top 20. David, there were no major shakeups from the Derby prep races run last week, but a couple of new names have emerged on the scene. Ironically, neither of them have won a race in the U.S. Who are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about Luxer Cafe and sorry, let's stop for a second. Who else are we talking about? Publisher.
So, runner-up in the Arkansas Derby.
Yeah.
He's a maiden, which is kind of bizarre. I don't know we've ever had a maiden on the Derby Watch Top 20, but Luxer Cafe, who won the Fukiru Stakes last week in Japan, and Publisher, a maiden, runner-up in the Arkansas Derby. They're both in the Kentucky Derby field. It's kind of a bizarre situation unfolding with the Derby Watch Top 20.
Yes, Brad, I wasn't quite able to stick with your trivia question there. Didn't think a Publisher on the spot. We'll keep that in, though, rather than have it as an outtake. Yes, definitely things have changed slightly on Derby Watch this week, but I don't think we saw too many major surprises with the preps from last weekend. And as we take a look at the top 20 list, you'll see that a couple things have been shaken up. 2 horses were dropped off the list. We'll get into why that's the case, but the 2 that have been added, Luxer Cafe and Publisher, 2 horses that have very different resumes coming in here. Luxer Cafe having won that race over in Japan, and we'll see if he accepts that invitation as the top Japanese qualifier. But I think a lot of people, myself included, impressed by the replay of that race. And Publisher just keeps plugging along, picking up checks in these races, Brad, and so far that's good enough to secure a spot in the Derby starting gate.
Publisher already has 60 points. He's virtually in the field. Luxer Cafe, the leading point earner on the Japan Road to the Derby Series. We're still awaiting confirmation as of midweek whether Luxer Cafe is coming to the Kentucky Derby, but he's a Triple Crown nominee. He's in the race if he wants to, and we'll talk more about his win in the Fukiru Stakes in a couple of minutes. In order to make room for Luxer Cafe and Publisher, the runner-up in the Arkansas Derby, we had to drop a couple. One of them was relatively easy. Matticat Road finished kind of a disappointing 4th in the Florida Derby considering his trip. The other one was not an easy decision because he's running this week, but Flood Zone is taking a rather circuitous route to the Kentucky Derby, a U.S.-based horse running this weekend in Dubai. I don't feel so bad about dropping him. I guess if he wins the UAE Derby, Flood Zone, we're going to have to reevaluate.
I suppose we will, but even if he wins the UAE Derby, it's not the easiest task to go all the way over to the Middle East and then come back 4 weeks later and run in a race like the Kentucky Derby. A lot has to go right for that plan to work out for Flood Zone to even make it to the Kentucky Derby starting gate. And we have some trepidations about dropping a horse who already has technically qualified for the race on points, but we did want to make room for Luxor Cafe if he accepts that nomination, as well as Publisher, who does already have the points to get in the starting gate. And at this point, Brad, I do think we have to start respecting the horses that have earned the points, and the connections do have the option to go to the Kentucky Derby. Horses like Flying Mohawk, who we're going to keep on the list, even though we're skeptical of his chances, but sounds like the connections want to go and he's got the points.
For sure. And wouldn't it be something for Publisher to win the very first race of his career in the Kentucky Derby? It's been done in the Breeders' Cup, a maiden winning Breeders' Cup 2-year-old races, but it's been a while since the Kentucky Derby was won by a maiden. In fact, according to Churchill Downs, there have been 12 maidens run in the Kentucky Derby since 1937. None of them hit the board. I think it was a horse by the name of Broker's Tip who won the Kentucky Derby as a maiden way back in 1933. That's even before I was born. Anyway, we have a maiden on the list. His name is Publisher. David, a couple of odds tweaks that you've made since last week. Citizen Bull from 8-1 down to 6-1. Citizen Bull is now the second favorite. He replaces Sovereignty, who finished second in the Florida Derby. They kind of flip-flopped. Tappan Street went to 10-1 following his win in the Florida Derby, and Sandman down to 12-1 after the Arkansas Derby. But the one odds tweak that you made, David, I want to ask you about regards Sovereignty. I was not disappointed in his runner-up finish in the Florida Derby. You lifted his price from 6-1 to 10-1 this week. Explain your rationale for raising the price that much on a very good colt.
Yeah, I think when these horses lose their final prep race, that air of invincibility sort of goes away. And Sovereignty is a horse who I think people were expecting to take some kind of step forward off his Fountain of Youth, where he was visually impressive but didn't earn the fastest speed figure. And he's kind of now plateaued from a speed figure standpoint. So when a horse like Journalism is going to be in the starting gate for the Derby, who's just run so much faster on the buyer scale, I think that there is going to be a little bit of skepticism around whether or not Sovereignty stacks up with some of the horses that have run faster. So that's why I raised his price a little bit, but he is certainly still squarely in the conversation as one of the top contenders.
Journalism and Citizen Bull right now rank among the fastest in the crop. I mean, I guess you got to throw Barnes in there as well off his runner-up finish in the San Felipe. But you're right about Sovereignty. His career high buyer so far is 95. We'll talk about his performance in the Florida Derby in just a minute, but he goes to 10-1. He's now the co-third choice, I believe, on your early odds line for the Kentucky Derby. Okay, there were 3 major stakes races last week, Derby prep races, 2 in the U.S., 1 in Japan. Let's start with the Florida Derby. There were 3 horses listed on Derby Watch in the Florida Derby field and 1 on the bubble horse, those being Sovereignty, Tappan Street, Matticat Road, and Disruptor. David, no real surprises in this race as the favorites ran 1-2 and pretty much dominated the race at the end.
Yeah, Tappan Street kind of became the wise guy horse coming into the race as he got bet down from, I think it was a 5-1 morning line. Just a horse that looked like he was really geared up for a top effort. He was working up a storm coming into this race, and he ran a big race in just the 3rd start of his career. I finished second to Burnham Square in the Holy Bull, and they stretched him out a little further in this Florida Derby. And Brad, I liked everything I saw from this horse. We could take a look at the replay of the race, and he broke sharply, which you definitely want to see for a horse that's pointing towards the Kentucky Derby. But the jockey was not so aggressive with him in the early stages, was comfortable letting him drift back through the pack to rate off the pace. But as soon as he pushed the button around the far turn, he accelerated, was able to get the jump on Sovereignty, and that proved to be the key point in this race, as Sovereignty was finishing through the wire, but just unable to reel in Tappan Street, who was able to get away from him in upper stretch. And, Sovereignty does feel like a horse who's going to get some added distance without a problem. We'll see if that's true of Tappan Street. The big issue, I think, with Tappan Street moving forward is just his general inexperience, making his 4th career start in the Kentucky Derby.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up. And that was one reason why I'm reluctant to endorse Tappan Street in the Kentucky Derby, a race in which will be only the 4th start of his career. But when you go back and look at recent history of the Kentucky Derby, maybe it's not such a big deal after all. And I say that because 2 years ago, Mage won the Kentucky Derby in the 4th start of his career. Justify in 2018 and Big Brown in 2008, both making their 4th career start in the Kentucky Derby. Now, Justify and Big Brown, they were just superior to the rest of the crop. I don't think you could say that about Mage. So maybe the seasoning, the foundation of races is less important nowadays than it was once upon a time. So I'm going to try to put that prejudice aside when we get closer to the Kentucky Derby. There's no doubt that Tappan Street is a very serious racehorse. He's improved each successive start, a 94 buyer speed figure last time out. And David, as you mentioned, he has that tactical speed. He's not going to be a horse that's at the mercy of he needs a pace meltdown to be effective. He can kind of make his own trip, right?
I think he can. He showed that good tactical speed chasing a faster pace on debut, but since then he's really relaxed in his races, and you saw that most apparently last time in the Florida Derby, being rated off the pace, showing no rankness in doing so, and then making the move when Luis Saez pushed the button. For a horse who is so lightly raced, Brad, I really like the fact that he's just shown more professionalism with each start, and unlike a horse like Mage, who felt like he had a lot of lessons to learn through the prep races, Tappan Street feels like one who kind of has a good mind on his shoulders and might be up to the task of competing in a race like the Kentucky Derby. But you still do have to take that inexperience into account with a horse that is going to be one of the shorter prices in all likelihood.
Yeah, it's a factor to consider. In my opinion, it's not a deal breaker. As far as Sovereignty goes, okay, maybe it was a little disappointing because everyone expected him to improve off his Fountain of Youth victory, his comeback victory. But David, the Florida Derby was not a race that Sovereignty had to win. He had a new jockey, a bad post, and the rider after the race said that Sovereignty might not have handled the Gulfstream Park track as well as he did in his previous start. I was not disappointed in Sovereignty's race, and I think we'll see a better colt on the first Saturday in May. What's your take on Sovereignty?
Yeah, I wasn't disappointed at all. And I thought Manny Franco actually gave a pretty good ride from post 10. He was able to save a little bit of ground around the turns on the horse. And I liked that he was still finishing at the end. There was that point in the Fountain of Youth where they really turned up the pressure on the leaders in the third quarter. And I think that kind of set the race up to fall apart a little bit at the end, which allowed Sovereignty to get there. That didn't happen in the Florida Derby. Tappan Street just has a little more stamina than a horse like River Thames and was able to see it out through the finish line. So it didn't really come back to Sovereignty, but he kept trying and grinding away all the way through the finish line. So he feels like a horse that is still on the trajectory to peak on Derby Day. He's going to have to run faster, but I think the hope is still out there that that could be the case.
Well, and it would be his fourth career start. He has every right to run faster. Tappan Street and Sovereignty, 1-2 finishers in the Florida Derby. They are now the co-third choices on the Derby Watch morning line by David Aragona at odds of 10-1. David, Matticat Road set the pace. He was under pressure from Neo Equos. I can get that out of my mouth. Neo Equos. He was under pressure, but Matticat Road did not run like a horse that wants a mile and 1/4. He has 46 points, which might be enough to get into the field. It would be uncharacteristic for trainer Bob Baffert to start Matticat Road in the Kentucky Derby off a fourth place finish in the Florida Derby. And that's one reason why we dropped him off the list.
Yeah, Bob Baffert is not one to start massive long shots in the Kentucky Derby. And I think we also have to keep in mind his top contenders for the race do have early speed. Matticat Road has early speed. He probably doesn't want to run too many horses with the same running style.
Exactly. The other horse that we should at least mention was Disruptor. He was eliminated at the break. He did not get out of the gate well at all. I thought he actually ran very well to finish fifth. But the problem is he does not have enough points to get into the Kentucky Derby. He might be a good colt, but for Derby aspirations, I think it's a little too late for him. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think we saw horses that are coming off maiden wins that were being asked a lot of by their connections in both the Florida Derby and the Arkansas Derby, and neither one worked out.
Well, the second U.S. stakes race last week was the Arkansas Derby, and whereas the Florida Derby unfolded at a relatively modest clip, the Arkansas Derby was a completely different scenario. 45 1/2 mile, the fastest half mile for an Arkansas Derby this century. And David, that absolutely benefited the 1-2 finishers.
Yeah, I was following on Twitter. The Churchill Downs race caller, Travis Stone, was tweeting about the historic nature of this pace. And he was saying in all 9 furlong races at Oaklawn, going back to, I think, 1990, it's the second fastest half mile out of all of them. So just an historically fast pace in this race. And it really took its toll on those that were forward and just set things up perfectly for the 1-2 finishers, Sandman and Publisher, who we already know benefit from races that feature strong paces up front. And they certainly got it last Saturday at Oaklawn.
Well, the thing about Sandman that I was impressed with in the Arkansas Derby is he followed through on his rally this time. And he's a good horse. I think he cost $1 million too as a yearling. He's gotten progressively better as the season has unfolded. With the right pace scenario in the Kentucky Derby, I don't see any reason why Sandman should not be a top contender in that race. As far as Publisher goes, he's a maiden, but he got a good trip the other day. He got a great setup. He ran well. That he would not shock me if Publisher were to pop up and win this race. What's your take on the runner-up finisher from the Arkansas Derby?
Yeah, let's take a look at the stretch run of that Arkansas Derby as we talk about these two, because Sandman strikes the lead, I think, earlier than Jose Ortiz would have expected, but that just shows how tired the two leaders were coming to the quarter pole of this race, that it just completely fell apart to the point that Sandman able to strike the front as they enter the stretch here. And you can see Publisher has the chance to go after him at about the 8th pole here. He's making up some ground, and Sandman swerves to the outside, a bit of an unfamiliar position for him, leading the field home through the final 8th of a mile. But once Jose gets him straightened out, he's able to stride through the wire, looking very much like a horse that is going to have no distance concerns as he goes further in the future. Brad, I did think Publisher in some ways got a slightly better trip than Sandman because he saved a little more ground on the turns, waited longer, made that last move. I don't think Sandman swerving in the stretch affected Publisher at all. I think there was an inquiry for this race, but it was frivolous. So I wonder if Publisher has that same stamina to continue his improvement going longer, and also a maiden trying to win his first start in the Kentucky Derby. That's a lot to ask of a horse, but he is going to be a much bigger price in all likelihood than Sandman will on the first Saturday in May.
Yeah, he certainly will. And by the way, speaking of Kentucky Derby maidens, I think that the trainer of Publisher falls right into that category. So Steve Asmussen looking for his first Kentucky Derby win. It'd be kind of strange, unique if a maiden were to pop up and give Asmussen his first win. But they're both contenders. Sandman specifically, publisher perhaps not so much. David, we should talk a little bit about the local hero, Cole Battle. You know, I know he made that early move on the far turn into the hot pace, and he had a right to kind of give it up late. I think he's plateaued. I love the story. Small guy in the big race. But I think that Cole Battle may have been exposed in the Arkansas Derby. Am I being too critical?
I think those that were on Cole Battle in the Rebel when he paid, I think, $24 to win, that was the day to get the money. I will be a little forgiving of his Arkansas Derby performance because when you have paces that completely collapse the way that this one did, you don't want to be the horse that's making that first move to take the race over, going after those leaders, because you're always going to be vulnerable to those that sat back and are making the late runs that have the most energy left for the stretch. And I think Cole Battle fell into that trap. I still wonder if he's a horse that is going to have the ability to go forward when they stretch out to 1.25 miles, because you can just see it through the stretch of that race. He's a little smaller. He's got a choppier stride. He doesn't give that same impression that he's going to be able to finish off the final furlong of a 10 furlong race the way that Sandman will. But he has proven to be an overachiever this far, so I don't want to completely write him off.
No, you can't write him off. A horse who's won 5 out of 8 starts. He's a good horse. I'm just not sure he's quite good enough to win the Kentucky Derby. His career high buyer speed figure is 91. That's a little bit on the light side. I'm not sure that the longer distance benefits Cole Battle. He's going to be difficult for me to endorse. I will say this. I saw an interview, I think it was on TVG after the race, that his trainer, Lonnie Briley, said that he only worked him 3 times between starts. He could have worked him 4. He's going to pound on him from between the Arkansas Derby and the Kentucky Derby, which I like to hear. He takes a fit, good horse who gets lucky and gets the right trip, and everything has to break his way. But Briley is going to hammer on Cole Battle in the next month leading up to the Kentucky Derby. So he could prove me wrong. But for now, I'm kind of anti-Cole Battle only from a handicapping the Kentucky Derby perspective. He might be a very, very good horse. He is a good horse. Anyway, that's the Arkansas Derby. It was Sandman and Publisher 1-2. Cole Battle possibly exposed. The third Kentucky Derby prep, there's look at our PPs real quick. As you can see, Sandman with a 99 buyer speed figure. He ran a fast race. That is a dynamite number in late March for a 3-year-old headed to the Kentucky Derby. And, you know, Publisher with a 95. David, just strictly on numbers, you'd have to at least respect the maiden to maybe possibly hit the board.
Yeah, I agree with that. But what I would say about the disparity in speed figures between the Florida Derby and the Arkansas Derby is that you will see this where races that feature very fast paces and fall apart for closers to run their ideal performances with their ideal pace setups will sometimes get faster speed figures than those horses would normally earn. So I wonder if the pace inflated this number a little bit. That's my one reservation about this Arkansas Derby moving forward.
No, that's a good point. A slow pace race is generally going to be a slower final time and therefore a lower figure. Fast paced races can often get a faster final time and a higher figure. It's a valid point with regards to Sandman and Publisher. They had circumstances working in their favor last Saturday and both ran well. A horse who ran well in Japan is a horse by the name of Luxer Cafe. He was the Japan points leader going into the Fukuru Stakes last week. And David, Luxer Cafe, despite racing wide from start to finish, he was pretty decisive. I guess the question is, who did he beat?
Well, we're not really sure about that because I'm not too familiar with the horses that were in behind Luxer Cafe, as I don't think you are either. Most of us American racing fans are not. But we do know this pedigree. I mean, he's an American-bred horse by American Pharaoh. He's a full brother to a horse named Cafe Pharaoh, who was a multiple Group 1 winner on dirt in Japan. I think even finished 3rd in the Saudi Cup against some of the best in the world. He's also a half-brother to Regal Glory, a very good runner that was in the Chad Brown barn, a Grade 1 winner, multiple Grade 1 winner on the turf. So the bloodline are certainly there for Luxer Cafe. And based on this performance that we'll take a look at from the Fukuru Stakes last week, this horse has the acceleration on the dirt of a turf horse, but is able to do it over 9 furlongs here, or the equivalent in metric of 1,800 meters, looking very much like a horse that might not struggle going a little further in the Kentucky Derby. Brad, I was all ready to say that this is not the year for the Japanese horses, and there's no Forever Young among this crop, and this horse still has a long way to go to prove that he's of that level. But I was way more impressed with this performance than I had been by his victory in the Hyacinth Stakes, where he came from mid-pack and the pace wasn't that fast, but he had to work a little harder for that one. This was a dazzling effort, slow pace, and as you said, he was wide every step of the way. But looking at the internal splits, he came home his final 200 meters, or eighth of a mile, in 12 seconds flat. So he was really finishing at the end here. We'll see what it means, because he's not going to get this kind of trip at Churchill Downs the first Saturday in May, sitting wide every step of the way with no kickback.
No, you can't go wide on both turns at Churchill Downs and expect to win the Kentucky Derby, but you could last week in Japan. And Luxer Cafe's 2 most dominant wins happened to be in the longest races of his career, a pair of mile and 1/8 races that he won by 5 lengths. So going from a mile and 1/8 to a mile and 1/4, that actually could benefit Luxer Cafe. The biggest question that we're going to have leading into the Kentucky Derby, how does he stack up class-wise? Because chances are there wasn't a whole lot behind Luxer Cafe in that stakes race last week in Japan, but this is a serious horse. He's won his last 4 starts, and the longer, the better for this son of American Pharaoh. So Luxer Cafe, David, did you have any doubts about making him 15-1? How difficult was it to price this horse on the Derby Watch odds line?
Yeah, it's a little difficult at this stage, because I think the initial reaction to a visually impressive win like that is to say, oh, he's just as good as the American horses, without really examining what was behind him or what he's done previously. I was seeing in some of the overseas books, he's listed even lower than that. I think some have him as low as 10-1. To me, that's going way overboard on a reaction to a horse that beat what was likely an overmatched field. But this horse clearly has some talent, and I'll be interested to see if they do confirm that he indeed is coming to Churchill Downs, how he progresses and trains in the morning, all of that leading up to the race.
The winner of the Fikuru Stakes last year was a horse named T.O. Password. He made his 3rd career start in the Kentucky Derby. He actually outran his price. He finished 5th at 48-1. Then you have to go back to 2019 for the most recent Fikuru starter who ran in the Kentucky Derby. That was Master Fencer. He finished 7th at 58-1. It's a small sample, and Luxer Cafe will be the 3rd horse from the Fikuru Stakes to make his next start in the Kentucky Derby. And Japan is going to make its presence felt wherever a big race is run. You know where it is on the first Saturday in May. Okay, before we start talking about the stakes races this coming weekend, let's talk about who's on the bubble, who's off the bubble. Still on the bubble, my favorite maiden winner in California, Baeza. He runs Saturday at Santa Anita in the Santa Anita Derby. It's kind of an all or nothing situation for Baeza, who has 0 Kentucky Derby points. David and I will talk about that in just a minute. David, the next 2 on the list, Final Gambit and Flood Zone, we really do not yet have confirmation that the Kentucky Derby is on their itinerary.
No, I just think we're waiting for more information about each of these horses. Final Gambit is not likely to run again before the Kentucky Derby, but it remains to be seen if he's going to wind up in the starting gate for that race on Derby Day, or the Grade 1 American Turf on the grass course at Churchill Downs, because he is a horse that's never run on the dirt, won the Jeff Ruby Stakes, but has a bit more of a turf profile. And I think Brad Cox wants to see the way that he trains on the dirt in the morning at Churchill before committing to that race. And Flood Zone, as we said earlier, going over to Dubai off a Gotham victory to contest that race across the globe, and then come back to the race in the Kentucky Derby in another 4 weeks, just seems like a very ambitious task to complete. So we'll see if they complete the first leg this Saturday, and then if they do ultimately circle the Derby as the target for him. But they're trying to do something that's never been done before.
It's a very difficult way to win the Kentucky Derby, go from the U.S. to Dubai, back to the U.S. But we'll find out more about Flood Zone this weekend in the UAE Derby. He's new to On the Bubble. We dropped him from the top 20. The other horse that's new to On the Bubble is Neo Equos, who finished an okay 3rd in the Florida Derby, and he has 40 points. I'm not sure if that's going to be enough to get in. We have him currently on the bubble. Grande and Sand Devil, both run this weekend in the Wood Memorial. The horses that we dropped from the On the Bubble were Cornucopian, who got in that crazy speed duel in the Arkansas Derby, and also Disruptor at a tough trip, finishing 5th. Those are horses that we are going to continue to monitor, including Baeza in the Santa Anita Derby. So let's talk about some of these races that will be run this weekend. And it's arguably the biggest Saturday of spring for Derby hopefuls. 3 major races in the U.S., the Santa Anita Derby, the Bluegrass Stakes at Keeneland, the Wood Memorial at Aqueduct, and the UAE Derby in Dubai. Let's start off, David, with the race that drew the smallest field, but arguably the best in terms of quality. I'm talking about the Santa Anita Derby. What do you see happening here?
Well, the top 2 favorites on our Derby watch are both supposed to contest this race in Journalism and Citizen Bull, and neither one of them needs to extract any points from the Santa Anita Derby to solidify their spot in the Kentucky Derby starting 8. They're both just fine in terms of the points race, but you do want to see these horses continue their progression heading into the first Saturday in May. With Journalism, you just want to see some confirmation of that 108 buyer that he got for winning the San Felipe, and Citizen Bull, I'd love to see a new dimension for this horse, Brad, because he's gotten to set slow paces, mostly uncontested leads, and all of his major wins. I don't know if it's going to be different on Saturday, but it's a tough thing to come into the Kentucky Derby not knowing if your horse can take pressure up front.
That's a good point. And because the only other speed horse in the Santa Anita Derby field is his stablemate Barnes, and Barnes recently has been trained to come from behind. So Citizen Bull could conceivably get the ideal front-running trip without a lot of pressure again in the Santa Anita Derby, and he could be long gone. But you made a valid point, David, about the point situation. Journalism and Citizen Bull, with 47.5 points and 60 points respectively, they're in the Kentucky Derby if they come out of the Santa Anita Derby in good shape. That's not the case for Barnes. He only has 18.75 points, and because only 5 maximum can run in the Santa Anita Derby, the points have been reduced. It's not a 150-25 points awarded to the top 3 finishers. It's reduced to 75, 37.5, 18 3/4. Barnes must finish 1-2 in order to get into the Kentucky Derby. And as far as Baeza, he has to win the race, because if he finishes second in a 5-horse field, 37.5 points for Baeza might not be enough this year. I think the cutoff is going to be right around 40 points. That's my guess anyway at this stage. So both Barnes and Baeza are in a tough spot. Westwood, he's a maiden running in the Santa Anita Derby. I don't really think we need to talk about him too much, but Barnes and Baeza, they're in a difficult situation with regards to points.
They definitely are. And I mean, if Barnes doesn't finish in the top 2, I think there's a question about whether Bob Baffert would press on to the Derby anyway with him. I know he's a $3 million horse and there's stud value in going to a race like the Derby. But as we said earlier, Baffert's not the type to press on to the Derby with a horse that doesn't really belong there. And yeah, you're right. Baeza probably needs to win this race to secure a spot in the Derby. It would be a little bit heartbreaking if he runs a solid second, maybe loses by a head or a neck and only gets 37.5 points. That'd be a tough waiting game for John Sheriff and the Connections. But we'll see if he really stacks up against this field. It's a big class test for him on Saturday.
No question about it. David, you and I are going to be taking an in-depth look at the Santa Anita Derby in a separate video. We'll go through the entire field and talk about each of them. It's not a race that Journalism has to win. He just has to run well, and I guess the same for Citizen Bull. Okay, the Bluegrass Stakes on Saturday at Keeneland. There's a quick look at Journalism and Citizen Bull. Journalism with that 108 buyer speed figure, and Citizen Bull with all those ones in his running line. 2 good horses running in the Santa Anita Derby. The Bluegrass Stakes at Keeneland. I tell you what, David, it's been a long time since the Bluegrass has produced a Kentucky Derby winner. As far as Derby prep races go, the Bluegrass has been one of the least productive. You have to go all the way back to 2007 to find a Kentucky Derby winner who ran in the Bluegrass. And before that, it was 1995 with Thunder Gulch. So I don't know how strong this race is. I do know this. It appears to be absolutely wide open. What are you looking forward to most in the Bluegrass?
Well, I will just point out that Bluegrass was a nose away from getting a Derby winner last year, with Sierra Leone just barely failing to get there at the very end of the race, maybe costing himself the race at the end. But as far as this year's Bluegrass is concerned, this is an interesting race regarding the points system moving forwards towards the Kentucky Derby, because we've got a few horses on Derby Watch that are running in here, but really all of them need to get points out of this race to secure their spot in the Kentucky Derby. It's a wide open race. As you throw up the field for this one, you could see from the the morning line. A tough race to really figure out who is going to be the favorite. I think River Thames was pegged as the slight favorite at 5-2. But I think one of the big key factors to keep in mind regarding this Bluegrass, Brad, is the weather situation that we're going to have in Lexington on Saturday. A ton of rain predicted on Thursday, Friday leading into Saturday, and none of these horses have any prior experience on a wet track.
Yeah, no doubt about it. Regarding the point situation, Owen Almighty is the only horse who doesn't have to worry about points. He already has 65. After that, the rest of them, they all need to come up with some points to make their way into the Kentucky Derby field. To me, David, the biggest question, I don't, from a betting perspective, I don't have a clue who's going to win this race, especially if it's on and off track. But I am very curious to see how Chancer McPatrick does around 2 turns, because I think, at least in my opinion, there's still a question whether he is best as a 1-turn closer or whether he can get the 2 turns. He finished 5th in the Breeders' Cup. He finished an okay 2nd in the Tampa Bay Derby in his recent comeback. I wonder if he is really a 2-turn horse. I guess we're going to find out a little bit more on Saturday at Keeneland if he handles the track. My gut feeling is he wants 1 turn, but I'm going to wait and watch him one more time. What's your take on Chancer McPatrick? Is he a 1-turn horse, or is it too soon to say?
I don't really know the answer, Brad, and we didn't get too many clues in that Tampa Bay Derby, and we're taking a look at the past performances of the top 2 finishers from the Tampa Bay Derby, because Owen Almighty got to go as slow as he wanted on the front end and just sprint away from the field through the stretch, and Chancer McPatrick did finish well to chase him home for 2nd, but he didn't have to exert himself too much in the early stages of that race. He was just showing his speed to chase home Owen Almighty, so I don't think we got too many clues about Chancer McPatrick's stamina in that Tampa Bay Derby. And now this is a race that's supposed to feature a little bit more pace, because you've got River Thames, Owen Almighty, and of course East Avenue, who has shown himself to be a need the lead type. So you would imagine Chancer McPatrick will get some pace to close into in this Bluegrass. We'll just see if he can produce that finish going 9 furlongs. Like you, I'm a little bit skeptical, especially if he's going to be a short price, because I could see when all is said and done, him going off as the favorite in this race.
Yeah, well, he's got a heck of a reputation, and last year he was one of the top 2-year-olds in the country. But his big wins were both around 1 turn in the Champagne and the Hopeful back in New York. So we'll find out on Saturday if Chancer McPatrick can A, handle a wet track, and B, if he can run 2 turns. That's the same question that they'll all be facing on Saturday at Keeneland on a wet track. The Wood Memorial will be run Saturday at Aqueduct. And David, Captain Cook, I think, is one of the top contenders in the field. I was very interested in wagering on California shipper Rodriguez, based on what I've seen in the mornings in his recent workouts at Santa Anita. But the Naira line maker kind of put a damper on those plans, because he laid Rodriguez as the 5-2 favorite. Any qualms about that?
I don't know, Brad. I mean, I'm questioning it a little bit. I released this line on Monday night where I made Rodriguez 5-2 and Captain Cook the 7-2 second choice. And I'm thinking maybe I should have switched those two, because I've seen more support for Captain Cook than I was expecting. And thanks to our producer, Bobby, who just slotted those in there perfectly on time. Captain Cook is a horse that was impressive when he won the Withers with a 94 buyer, but this is a big class test, because this Wood Memorial came up a much stronger race than the Withers did. And it's an interesting race to handicap. I think just purely from a wagering standpoint, Brad, I found this to be the most intriguing race of the 3 this weekend.
Well, I'm looking forward to seeing if you can come up with a price, because I'm kind of locked in on the morning line favorite Rodriguez. Captain Cook, I think, is a serious contender off his effort in the Withers. Lightly raced. It's been 2 months. And for both these colts, both Rodriguez and Captain Cook, in fact, for the entire field, everybody in this field, David, is chasing points. Everybody, it's almost they have to come out and run well. It's not a case where, like a Journalism or a Sovereignty, where they just need to run around the track this weekend to get to Kentucky. These horses need to do something to make their way into the Derby field, right?
They do. And I mean, that's one of the reasons why I find it interesting that Baffert has even shipped Rodriguez to this race, because you would think between Barnes and Rodriguez, they both need points, and Barnes is the more high profile of the two. He's running in the race where it's a little tougher to get the points out of the Santa Anita Derby. Rodriguez is coming here where he looks like one of the top contenders. Baffert does not send too many horses to the Wood Memorial historically. So interesting that he's even showing up here. We mentioned, you mentioned the blinkers coming off at his improved workouts coming into this race. So I think it's very easy to forecast an improved performance for Rodriguez, but there's pace in this race. He drew the rail. They probably want to be aggressive with Mike Smith getting aboard. So I could see this race going a number of different ways. And there are a few prices in here that I find a little bit interesting, but I'm doing a preview of this race with Mike Beer that will be available on the Daily Racing Form YouTube channel a bit later on Wednesday. So definitely check that out.
All right, that's the Wood Memorial on Saturday at Aqueduct. Finally, a 3-year-old race, another 3-year-old race. It's actually the first one on Saturday. There's a quick look at Captain Cook and Grande. Grande, 2 for 2, stretching out or running in New York for the first time. Mm-hmm. And if he runs well, he'll be in the Kentucky Derby field, and he'll be one of those horses with only 3 starts going into the Kentucky Derby if he runs well Saturday in the Wood Memorial. Those are 2 leading contenders, Captain Cook and Grande. Okay, regarding the final, or actually, it's actually the first 3-year-old Derby prep on Saturday. It's over in Dubai. It's the UAE Derby. David Flood-Zone has been on our Derby Watch Top 20 list, and he's the favorite in early betting for the UAE Derby. We took him off the list because this is just a tough way to get to the Kentucky Derby, going from the U.S. to the UAE and back to the US, but there's no doubt that this is a serious racehorse, Flood-Zone.
Yeah, and the strange thing about this, Brad, is the Churchill Downs has changed the point system this year, where the UAE Derby is no longer in the general pool of races offering Kentucky Derby points. It's now part of the European/Middle East road to the Kentucky Derby. So there's going to be one qualifier from that route. And obviously, the UAE Derby is the race in that series that offers the most points. So the UAE Derby winner will be guaranteed a spot in the Kentucky Derby starting gate. But Flood-Zone doesn't need to take that path to get into the Derby because he already got 50 points from the Gotham. So he is already safely in the Derby starting gate if they want to go. So the fact that they're running over there, maybe they just think it's a pot that they can scoop up. It's a race that he can win. He is owned by interests that have horses that race all over the world. So I guess they don't mind having this horse become a globetrotter like some others. But still, it's an unprecedented path to take. And I personally have some major questions about whether or not a mile and 3/16 is going to be up this horse's alley, because I had personally concerns about him getting a mile in the Gotham, and he handled that. But 2 turns can sometimes be a different story.
Well, Flood-Zone is the early favorite, at least in the UAE Derby. And, there's nothing wrong with making the UAE Derby their focal point of spring. If that's what the connections of Flood-Zone want to do, then fine. It's a big purse. They race horses in Dubai. And to me, it almost seems like the Kentucky Derby would be a relative afterthought. But let's get through the UAE Derby first, see if Flood-Zone can stay the 2 turns, and then we'll reassess his chances for the Kentucky Derby when we talk about all these races next week. The main 3-year-old story this week was Tappan Street in the Florida Derby. Sandman rallying from behind that hot pace to win the Arkansas Derby. Baffert trained Cornucopian and Matticat Road did not run like Derby candidates last weekend, but Baffert is well represented this weekend with Citizen Bull and Barnes in the Santa Anita Derby. Rodriguez in the Wood Memorial. Captain Cook tops the Wood Memorial. Journalism is still the Kentucky Derby favorite, and we will cover all of that next week on Derby Watch. For David Aragona, I'm Brad Free. See you next week.